Hello, everyone on LinkedIn, and thank you for tuning in to today's live, or you might be catching this on the replay. Today, I'm joined by Shane Twomey. Shane was my guest on the podcast, which came out last Friday, and we had a great conversation all about managing the hybrid workforce. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to get Shane on to the live today to talk a little bit about the podcast. Shane, do you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll talk a bit about the feedback that the podcast has been getting?
Hello, everybody. Shane Twomey from Organisation Dynamics. I'm an organisation design and development specialist, and I work with organisations to design their organisation in order to deliver on their strategy. Basically been working for the last 30 years in the human resources and organisational space.
Brilliant. And Shane, I know you posted something about the podcast earlier in the week, which has got really, really great feedback. And I know certainly people have reached out to me directly to say how great they thought the podcast was and really insightful and stuff like that. Do you want to give people sort of a flavour of what we actually spoke about for anyone who hasn't listened to it yet? Like what did we cover on the podcast?
So obviously the last year has had a major impact on managing people since last March when the COVID hit and a lot of people ended up working from home. So what we talked about was what are the challenges that managers have in managing a hybrid workforce or a distributed workforce, where you have some people who are still in the office because their jobs require them to be in the office, or they're essential workers and they're at the front line. Some employees are now working full-time from home, and some employees are working partly from home and partly from the office, or whatever the working environment is. And what are the different challenges that managers face in having to manage people that aren't necessarily in front of them the whole time? And it's a whole new skill set, and it's a whole new mindset for organizations. So what we talked about was what leaders need to think about, and what I have been advising companies to do is take a deliberate approach to this. Don't just allow it to evolve, because it'll evolve in a certain way and it may not be the way that you want to end up with. So if you start taking a deliberate approach to it, you can actually affect some change and get the outcomes that you want, as opposed to the outcomes that will evolve and maybe not the ones that you want.
Yeah, I really like that approach of being deliberate. And I'm not sure if you saw, but like there was a few things going around on the internet, on BBC, I think, was one of the ones that was reporting it, about one guy in particular who he wanted his staff to have Zoom on all day so that he could watch them, so that he could control them. And like the kind of things that we're talking about is like very anti doing that. It's not about controlling. It's not about constantly monitoring people. It's about giving them enough guidance to know what set clear expectations, and then let them get on with the job and do it.
Yeah, and funnily enough, we talked about it on the podcast that one of my clients, a manager, said that I can't wait to have all my staff back in the office so I can check up on what they're doing. And my response back was, well, what are they doing now? And how do you know? And are they doing the work the way you want them to? And he says, yeah, they are, but I prefer to have them in front of me. And it was a kind of a perverse reaction as far as I was concerned, because if they're achieving the work now, then what difference does it make where they are? And I talked to managers about, instead of managing inputs and managing by time, as you described it, manage by outputs. Yeah. Set the expectation of what you want them to achieve and let them achieve it, because you've got to allow people to adapt to the circumstances that they're in. Having somebody on Zoom the whole time just doesn't make any sense, because you're not taking into account what people's environments are, whether there's homeschooling going on, whether they've elderly people, whether they've got somebody in the house that's self-isolating. You have to allow people to take into account their circumstances. And if they're getting the work done, what does it matter how or when they get the work done?
Absolutely, yeah. You won't have any arguments from me on that anyway, Shane. I am a big advocate of this whole idea of it's about outcomes versus the input. So it doesn't matter how long it takes you to do something. And I suppose my argument would be, if it takes you much longer than you might expect, then maybe you're not doing the right thing, or you're not finding all the efficiencies that you could have. We've got a comment there from Sarah saying, goodness, organizations should trust their own hiring process in order to trust their staff. And definitely totally agree with that. if you're hiring people that you don't ultimately trust, then there's something wrong with you rather than with the person that you're not necessarily trusting.
Absolutely. And also, if you put managers in place that don't trust their employees, maybe you need to look at the managers that you've put in place as well.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. I know on a previous podcast, Andrew Barnes talked about, when he talks about the 4-day week and reducing people's hours, but still maintaining or often increasing the level of productivity by reducing the number of hours that people are expected to work, that sometimes he'll get questions like, but how do you measure productivity? And he's sort of saying, like, that's the wrong question to be asking. If you don't know how to measure productivity currently, then there's something wrong in your business, and you need to look into how you're currently measuring whether people are being productive or whether they're achieving the outcomes that you've set out in the business or not.
Absolutely. And we talked about on the podcast about the notion of managing time. I think you brought it up, and this notion of managing the 40-hour week or whatever it is. And it is a lever that organizations have, but if that's the only lever that they're using, then they're missing an awful lot of measurements that they should be measuring. And whether somebody gets their work done in 10 hours or somebody gets their work done in 60 hours, if it's the same amount of work, if it's spread out over a different amount of time, what does it matter? So long as the work is the outcome. Now, I'm not saying that somebody will take 60 hours or 10 hours, but if it's spread out over a different time period, to take into account their circumstances.
Yeah, totally agree. There were also, just to wrap it up, we talked about 3 different types of dynamics. Do you want to share with those for anyone who's curious about the podcast and wants to know a bit more?
So what I talk about in the podcast, and I'm talking about with my clients, is what I call the 3 dynamics of the workplace. It's the social dynamic, the creative dynamic, and the power and influencing dynamic. The social dynamic is all of those small social interactions that we have that create the workplace. And we are social animals. We are tribal animals. We thrive on interactions. And when people are working in a distributed workforce, we don't have those social interactions. And it's those social interactions that lead to the power and influencing dynamics, how I influence you, how I manage you. And I don't mean manage in a negative sense, but how I set you up for success come out of those social dynamics. Because if we don't have a relationship, then you won't trust me and I won't trust you. And that comes out of our social dynamic. And the creative dynamics also come out of those social dynamics, because I talk about that creativity favors the connected mind. And it's those little bit of connections that we have, that the comment that's made over coffee, or the comment that's made on the way into the meeting room as opposed to what happens in the meeting room, that creates the creativity in an organization. And when we have this distributed hybrid workforce, we don't have those dynamics. So we have to find a way of not recreating them as they are in the organization, but recreating the dynamic in a natural way as opposed to an unnatural way. So it's not always going to be about having everybody on a Zoom call every day.
Yeah.
How do you create those dynamics? There's different ways of doing it that we talk about on the podcast, but it's about looking at those. And that's what we talked about at the very beginning of this live session, is doing it deliberately. You have to be deliberate about it. You can't expect it just happen by itself, because something will happen, but it won't necessarily be something that you want to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, like, that phrase that you used on the podcast about the creativity and the connection, that is something that I know just this morning I got some feedback from Liz McGuire, who said that's something that really struck a chord with her, that the organization she works in, they strive to do all of the kind of things that we had mentioned on the podcast anyway, because it is a really great environment to work in. But she said that specifically struck a chord. Now, something else that I wanted to share is that this idea of trust. So Sarah has used the word trust twice in her comment, and trust is something that the phrase that you've used a couple of times. Trust is so important in an organization, and it goes both ways, exactly like you said, Shane. So on the one hand, it's trusting your employees, but also that the employees will trust that the organization has their best interests at heart. There is a previous podcast all about trust with Team and Bart. I can't remember the exact number that it falls under, but if you search for the Happier at Work podcast, you'll certainly find it. And I know there will be a future episode on trust as well for anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about that.
Well, trust is the currency of the workplace.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree. Any sort of parting words, and maybe that's it, that trust is the currency of the workforce, and watch this space for future episodes.
I think that's about it, yes. I don't think there's anything else. Go listen to the podcast and you'll get lots more from the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's about 45, 50 minutes long and full of loads of practical tips. So thank you so much for your time, Shane.
Right, and thank you for having me on the Happier at Work podcast. I really, really enjoyed the conversation.